Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the 4th Annual Northern Ontario Ag Conference. My name is Cameron Ford, and I am the Project Development Advisor for the Northern Ontario Farm Innovation Alliance, and I will be your MC for the conference, both today and tomorrow. And before we get into the first session, I'm just going to do a little bit of housekeeping. So before we get started, I would like to take a moment for reflection. We would like to acknowledge the Indigenous peoples of all lands that we are on today. I would like to take a moment to acknowledge the importance of the lands which we all call home. We do this to reaffirm our commitment and responsibility in improving relations between nations and to improve our own understanding of local Indigenous groups and their cultures. From coast to coast to coast, we acknowledge the ancestral and unceded territories of all Inuit, Métis, and First Nations peoples that call this land home. Please join me in a moment of reflection to acknowledge the harms and mistakes of the past and to consider how we are and can, each in our own way, try to move forward in a sense of reconciliation and collaboration. Thank you. I will now move on to the housekeeping items. So we are recording all of the events of this webinar, and I will be putting them up online on the Northern Ontario Farm Innovation Alliance YouTube page for anyone who missed them or anyone who would like to watch them again. Keep an eye on Nofia's social media, and we will let you know when those videos are available. Right now, only speakers have permission to turn on their video and microphone, but the audience is encouraged to ask questions through the Q&A feature down at the bottom of your screen. And I will read out any questions to the speaker at the end of each presentation. You are also welcome to share your ideas with the chat feature, which we will be monitoring, though we ask that you please keep comments respectful and on today's topic. If anyone has any questions that do not get answered or would like to get in touch with the presenters to learn more, you can reach out to me and I can put you in touch with the presenters. This conference is presented in partnership with the Rural Agri Innovation Network, who will be moderating a couple of sessions, one today and one tomorrow. And David Thompson, RAIN's manager, will be talking a bit about what RAIN does later on this morning. I would also like to thank the Chicken Farmers of Ontario, BioEnterprise Canada Corporation, the Cooperation Council of Ontario, and FedNor and the Government of Canada for sponsoring this conference. We will also be hearing from our sponsors later on this morning. All of the events in this conference will share this Zoom link, and the link will stay live for the length of the conference, so you will be able to tune in and out as much as you like. The timing for events for both today and tomorrow is pretty much the same, with a morning session that will run from about 9:45 to 11:30, and then a break until 1, and then we will regroup and have a session in the early afternoon that will run from 1 to 2:30, and then another half-hour break, and then we'll have our final session of the day from about 3 o'clock to 4:30 p.m. There are a couple of different kinds of presentations that we'll see during this conference. Some of the presenters will be presenting live, while some have recorded their presentations in advance, and I will simply play those recordings. In either case, the presenter will be here and will be able to answer questions following their presentation. So without further ado, we will get into the first session of the Northern Ontario Ag Conference. Our first presentation is from Dr. Amanda Diochon from Lakehead University in Thunder Bay. Amanda is an associate professor in the Department of Geology and a certified NASM planner. She is the program coordinator for water resource science, the director of Lakehead University's environmental lab, and the president-elect of the Canadian Society of Soil Science. Today, she will be presenting on her project entitled Clearing the Way for Agricultural Expansion in Northern Ontario. Does mulching make sense? Her presentation is pre-recorded, so I will play that now, and feel free to put any questions in the Q&A function and we will answer them after the presentation.
Good morning from Thunder Bay. I want to begin by saying that I'm extremely grateful to live and work on the traditional territory of the Fort William First Nation, which is signatory to the Robinson Superior Treaty of 1850, and to be able to learn in a spirit of reconciliation from the many nations that have a history in this area. I'm really excited to be here with you this morning to share the results from some ongoing work on land clearing for agricultural expansion in the north and to pose a question for you to consider as we move through this presentation, which is, does mulching make sense? So over the last 20 years, I've been encountering fewer climate change deniers, which is really fantastic because I think we can all agree that temperature and moisture patterns are changing, and quite significantly. On the left, we have a figure showing the change in the growing season over several decades, which is showing an increase in the growing season. And on the right, the relationship between the increase in global temperatures and the temperatures in Canada. And on the right to the bottom, a pretty strong positive relationship between the length of the growing season and temperature increases. This also lends itself to the expansion of agriculture and a change in the crops that can be grown in more northern regions. The opportunities presented by a changing climate, particularly in the face of concerns around food security for northern regions and for northern Ontario, is something that's been attracting a lot of interest on the ground and in the scientific community. So we just have here a sprinkle of papers that have come out in the last 5 years. All are available through open access if you haven't had a chance to read them yet. And in addition to highlighting the opportunities, these papers also address some of the challenges surrounding agricultural expansion in the north and in particular in northern Ontario. So a lot of the challenges that have been identified in these papers have been ongoing challenges for over 100 years. And assuming that most of the attendees here are from Northern Ontario or have some knowledge of agriculture in Northern Ontario, it comes as no surprise that although we have lots of land, most of it is forested. And the soils, if we consider the region as a whole, would be really quite marginal. But there are pockets of class 2, 3, and 4 land, which is where we find most of the agricultural activity today. And the clay belt has received particular attention because of its favorable soils. So agriculture in the region has seen lots of highs and lows. And in doing some of the sampling for this work that we'll explore this morning, I've come across many rock piles in the forests around Thunder Bay, and participants have been really generous in sharing the history of farming in the area. So there's quite a bit of secondary forest that's grown up on former agricultural land, and that I would consider, if I was going to be doing land clearing, would be attractive. So for the last 20-ish years, I've been looking at the effects of forest and agricultural management practices on soil organic matter, and in particular, soil organic carbon stocks and stores. So there's no shortage of papers highlighting the effects of converting forest to agriculture, but one paper that caught my interest was published in Scientific Reports in 2014. And in this paper, Way et al. Mine the literature to look at the effects of land conversion in different regions. And one of those regions was the boreal. So the boreal forest region stores a lot of carbon in its soils. And there are a few things that really jumped out at me from this study. In general, generally speaking, we see a rapid initial decrease in soil organic carbon stocks that tends to be followed by a slow decline. So this has been attributed to tillage, which busts up soil aggregates and makes organic matter available for decomposition by the microbial community. The second thing is that the decrease was greater when those initial stocks were greater. Thirdly, a 30% decrease in the boreal, but the data set was quite limited, and that's what this little circle is showing. I'm not entirely sure how they did the stats with no data in that less than 10-year age class, but whatever. And fourth, that soils with a high initial carbon stocks in areas with potential for rapid warming, like the north, were identified as gaps. So findings from a recent study by Benakazar, which is in press for the special issue on soil health in Canadian Journal of Soil Science, in the Thunder Bay area. These findings were consistent with the findings of Wei et al. So declines happen pretty quickly in our area, and that's indicated up in the top left-hand panel. And the good news, though, is that from a soil health perspective, soil quality is still very good. So we know and have known for some time that land conversion results in a significant loss of soil organic matter. So why do we care? Why do we care about these declines in soil organic matter, in wet aggregate stability, in microbial respiration, in total carbon and nitrogen stores? Well, because all of these things are related to organic matter. And organic matter is a key determinant of soil and site productivity. So it provides numerous ecosystem functions, and it's a storehouse of nutrients required by plants for growth. So is there any way that maybe we can mitigate some of these losses? Well, several years ago, when OMAFRA had a new directions call for northern livestock, I was chatting with Christina Mole, who told me about the mulching study that was happening in northeastern Ontario, and she put me in touch with Steph Van Hoff. Well, it nearly blew my mind, and I got super excited, and I'm still super excited about mulching. So in case you aren't aware, there was a 3-year study that was entitled Rapid Development of Farmland from Boreal Forest, and an evaluation relative to traditional clearing methods. So there were 3 sites, but I'm going to focus on the 2 that I've done some follow-up work on. So the goal of this study was to better understand mulching as part of the land clearing process with the specific objectives of assessing and mitigating soil impacts and crop growth with mulching and subsoiling, and to look at the economics. So I'm going to focus on the former. So mulching, of course, soil organic matter stores. And I'm oversimplifying, but they're like a bank. So if you take out more than you return, then your balance is going to go down. So with conventional clearing, we're removing a lot of that topsoil, we're pulling out the stumps, we're basically bulldozing everything at the surface into piles and or off to the side. So we're removing organic matter that would otherwise be incorporated into the soil. So with mulching, and in particularly with subsoiling, we're grinding up all of that goodness and we're incorporating it into the soil. But what does that do to the balance? And what does that mean for crops? Well, let's find out. So in Cochrane, the site was logged, mulched, and subsoiled in 2015. In Temiskaming, the site was logged and stumped several years prior and had grown up into scrub brush. So the scrub was mulched and subsoiled in 2015 as well. So both of these sites were geo-referenced on a 1-acre grid system. And that's kind of what we're seeing here with this little schematic. And there were 20 soil cores collected per acre to a depth of 0 to 15 centimeters. Soils were sent to A&L in London for analysis. And for the 3 years of the study, there were plant counts and yield data collected. So in the interest of time, I'm going to focus on the organic matter and carbon concentrations in stocks. And I used a paired t-test to compare the organic matter concentrations in 2015 when the study started, and in 2019, which actually represents the end of the 5th year. in the treatments. So we can see in Cochrane, which is on the left, that after 5 years, there was no effective land conversion on organic matter concentrations. I would also like to point out that the concentration of organic matter is higher in the area that was cleared conventionally. And maybe I didn't talk about that in a few slides back, but there were a couple of acres in Cochrane that were cleared conventionally. This area is actually also a bit wetter. In Temiskaming, organic matter levels actually declined and almost to the point of being significant. So, okay, great. Well, you might be asking, why are you going to tell me more about the organic matter at these sites? Well, because sometimes just looking at total organic matter in the whole soil doesn't tell the whole story. And there weren't any archive soils from that initial collection. So in 2019, we went back to the sites and we sampled the forests adjacent to the sites. And in the case of Temiskaming, um, there were some areas that weren't mulched, and essentially we created some additional plots. So if you recall, the area was actually logged in 2012, 2013. So we can see, assuming that the forest is representative, that there has been significant declines in organic matter, in soil carbon, and in sand fraction carbon. So we can see those declines as we move across the slide. So what these changes likely reflect are a decline in inputs and an increase in the rate of cycling with land conversion. And by about 47%, if we're just looking in the sand fraction specifically, it's quite sensitive to changes in the rates of inputs and outputs of organic matter. So what's kind of interesting is that there's no significant change in carbon to nitrogen in the soil. Normally, with a decline in carbon, we might see a narrowing of this ratio reflecting the increase in microbial activity. So, maybe this is being confounded by the incorporation of wood, which typically has a wider carbon to nitrogen ratio. So I would expect to see a difference in the sand fraction, actually, which typically represents that recently incorporated organic matter, but it may be, and it's likely, perhaps, that the wood residues really haven't been captured in this analysis. Wood takes a while to decompose, and it may not be included in the sample itself, or it might be sieved out prior to analysis. So in Cochrane, we have a little bit of a different story. And I've been struggling a little bit with these results because I don't necessarily feel that they're accurate, because the area that was conventionally cleared had a higher initial carbon concentration. So just kind of keep that in mind as we move through, because you'll see with conventional clearing, things are a little bit higher for the most part. So we can see that mulching resulted in significant declines of organic matter, of soil carbon, and sand fraction carbon concentrations. At this site, we do see significant changes in bulk density and in a direction that I would anticipate, and reflects those changes in organic matter. Bulk density is increasing with conversion, at least with mulching, and we can see that soil carbon stores have declined significantly with mulching in both total soil carbon and also sand fraction carbon as well. So at this site, we do see a change in the soil carbon to nitrogen ratio, a significant narrowing in both fractions that's consistent with an increase in decomposition. So the organic matter in the sand fraction has a wider ratio overall, which is reassuring, but again, a narrowing of the carbon to nitrogen ratio consistent with microbial processing of organic matter. So I would say overall, we are seeing these declines in organic matter, and we're still seeing declines, significant declines in organic matter with mulching, which I have a little sad face on right now. But the story doesn't end there. So in 2019, we also did some field sampling around Thunder Bay, and we just focused in strictly on soil properties. So we sampled forest and field pairs. And so I'm just actually going to share the relevant subset of data that draws on sampling of 9 conventional and 7 mulched field forest pairs that were converted less than 10 years ago, and a smaller subset because fewer people were clearing of sites that were cleared more than 10 years ago, but really close to 10 years. I'm also mostly going to focus on soil properties that we've already seen. And I took a bit of a different approach with these sites because all of these sites are quite different. And what I'll share or what I tested for were differences relative to the forest. So you'll see percent changes. So unlike the sites in northeastern Ontario, I actually didn't find any differences in the sites that were cleared less than 10 years ago. But there were some differences in the comparisons focusing on sites cleared more than 10 years ago. So for organic matter concentration, for soil moisture, for soil carbon concentration, soil nitrogen concentration, and soil carbon to nitrogen ratio, which is what's being depicted in these figures, there was actually no difference between the forest and the mulch site. So you can see it's overlying that 0. So what that's saying is that there's no difference with the forest site with mulching. However, there were differences between the forest and the sites that were cleared conventionally, and these declines were about 30% for organic matter and for soil carbon, really consistent with what was reported by Way et al. And also by Benekazar. Though we're seeing these changes in this data set anyway, just a little bit later. So what I would like to entertain you with is that maybe mulching has benefits for soil properties and soil health, but perhaps we're not going to see them until the longer term. And that, that's kind of making some sense to me because it does take time for the wood to break down and be incorporated. So, as much as I love talking about soil, and I'd love to just continue talking about soil, I think that producers may be just as, if not more, interested in yield. So back over to northeastern Ontario, and I'm just going to share some data that was collected by NOFIA in 2016 in Cochrane and Temiskaming. So here we have the Cochrane site 2016, just a bit of that design where half the site was planted with clover, half was planted with clover and oats, and then we have that conventionally cleared site. So in comparing the height of clover and oats on mulched and conventionally cleared plots in Cochrane, it's pretty clear that the plants were shorter in soils that were mulched, and there was also fewer plants per unit of area. So heading down the road to Temiskaming with a kind of similar design. Again, what we're seeing is that in general, shorter plants in plots that were mulched and fewer plants per unit area in plots that were mulched. So there were several issues that were identified out of this study. And there were concerns that the wide carbon to nitrogen ratio of the wood maybe is altering some of that nitrogen availability and soil fertility more generally. So the soil test results were quite similar prior to and after land conversion, but as we've seen, the heights and the density were not. And this kind of echoes what I've heard from producers who have mulched. So yields may be kind of comparable in year 1 to a conventionally cleared site, but after that year, then they tank for a few years after that. To get, yields up into something, kind of more profitable, soils require significantly more fertilizer to increase yields. And these recommendations are not always apparent in soil testing. So soil testing recommendations based on soil testing don't reflect this. So I am mindful of the need to wrap up, and I'm continuing to throw new things at you. But I just wanted to quickly share some pretty preliminary results from a pot trial where we estimated wood inputs based on a vegetation survey. So we went out into the forest, did a survey and inventory of all the trees that were there. Um, Anything that was less than 13 centimeters diameter breast height, we used some equations to estimate um, how much wood would be present at least above ground, and came up with rates of wood retention. So 25, 50, 75, and 100% retention. And we chipped wood of some saplings or some small trees that were actually harvested from the site. And we added that to pots and containing soil from the same site. These pots were seeded with barley at recommended rates and fertilized at rates recommended by through soil testing. And so we had controls, we added fertilizer, and then we also amended the pH and the fertilizer. So we can see here that there was actually, I'm just going to tell you, there was no effect of the fertilizer or nutrient amendments on the number of plants at harvest. But we can see that when wood was incorporated, there was actually more plants per pot than when wood wasn't incorporated, which is kind of opposite of what we saw in the Cochrane or at the Cochrane and Temiskaming sites. So where things maybe get a little bit interesting, and I'm going to say, maybe a little bit complicated too, um, from a yield perspective, is when we look at the soil amendments. So top left-hand corner, we have the control. So this is just the soil, planted the barley, see what happens. Not surprising, yields are lower than the other treatments, but only significantly lower when we retained all of that wood biomass on site. So not surprising if we go over to the top right, when we add fertilizer at the recommended rates, yields across the board go up. But we're adding fertilizer based on these recommended rates for each of these individual soils. And hopefully what is apparent is that we see this kind of linear decline in yields with fertilizer addition. So kind of suggestive of what farmers are sharing when I'm out in the field. Down at the bottom, we have both that pH adjustment, either with ag lime or with wood ash and fertilizer. With the lime and fertilizer, we can see kind of almost an exponential decline in yields, a bit less so with the wood ash, but wood ash also contains other nutrients. So maybe speaking a little bit to that, to the nutrient story. So again, all plots receive the recommended rates of fertilizer and pH amendment as appropriate. So in theory, the yield should all be the same, but clearly it was not. This is just the beginning of this study, and it's the first of 5 rotations, so stay tuned. Maybe if I didn't totally bomb on this, they might have me back. So we started off this morning with the hypothesis that mulching would help to mitigate some of those soil organic matter declines associated with land clearing. So that's happy, Mandy. What we found, at least initially, is that it's kind of complicated. Initially, we see declines in yields and the need to add additional fertilizer. In the longer term, we may see returns once that wood has had a chance to break down. This, of course, takes time, and the more we're able to learn, then the more confident we can be in making these recommendations. So I have a project that is in the early days. It's funded by Grain Farmers of Ontario and NSERC Alliance and Lakehead University Agricultural Research Station. And this project is, the plan is to do a pan-northern sampling, comparing conventional and mulched land clearing approaches on soil health, and also to start a field trial looking at different land conversion practices. So, you know, we blitzed the Thunder Bay area this past year because of COVID and some other issues. I haven't gone east or west. But if you have cleared land in the last 10 years to either conventionally or incorporating mulch, I'd really love to connect with you. And if you'd let me come to your farm, I would love to sample your soils. So big thank yous to everybody that helped out with this project. You know, it's been really, really amazing. I love this project. You know, I'm really excited to have my feet in both agriculture and forestry. And so looking forward to see what you guys think. Thank you for your time.
Thanks for that, Amanda. And now we've had a few questions through the Q&A function. A couple of them you've already answered, but perhaps we'll just revisit them. So is there an optimal organic matter percentage? Too much costs nitrogen to break down carbon and other minerals, too little impact on yield. So what do you think about that optimal organic matter percentage?
That's a really great question, and a really tough question to answer from the perspective of, you know, where is that? How is that? What does that organic matter look like? Because not all organic matter that's present in the soil is necessarily available to cycle and or be decomposed. And so, as Barry mentioned, you know, if you have too much, it's going to cost a lot of nitrogen to break that down. And I think that's what we see with the wood. So if you have you know, a more sandy textured soil, which is not going to be optimal for agriculture, but a lot of your organic matter might be stored in that fraction, and there may be a higher end cost, where in a heavier textured soil, the organic matter may be stored slightly differently. And so the availability of that organic matter and how quickly it cycles is going to vary across sites. So in terms of an optimal organic matter percentage, I mean, I think that to a large extent, that's going to be area specific.
Thank you. So how much do the outcomes of mulching depend on the tree species, the size, the age of the trees, the density of the forest that's been cleared? Given that a lot of the forest in Northern Ontario has been previously logged or cleared at some point, you know, are there different outcomes between old growth forests and more recently reforested, you know, newer growth areas?
Yes, and I realize my internet connection is saying that it's unstable. So hopefully you guys are still able to hear me okay.
You sound good on my end.
Okay, perfect. So again, this is another great question, and something that really has given me a lot of pause for thought, because I mean, the tree species question is probably coming from that coniferous deciduous pH of the residues perspective. And I mean, for sure, that's going to have an effect, the age and the density. And that's really was the motivation for this greenhouse trial, which I started off and I'm like, oh yeah, we're going to start off and we're going to have trembling aspen, and then we're going to have some spruce, and then we're going to do mixed. And so, I mean, I think that that's a question that's really important, and that hasn't really been resolved. And I mean, I think we can learn something from all the work that's been done in forestry, but also the density of the forest, and thinking about, okay, well, how much should we actually be retaining on site? Because I think it may come down to that, maybe a bit of a balance, and maybe mulching just doesn't make sense. And I mean, as a scientist, I'm completely open to that possibility. And yeah, so I guess to sum it up, I think that all of those factors do play a role, and then you have to superimpose upon that climate differences across Northern Ontario, and soil differences as well. So it's definitely not straightforward.
So for that barley that you were talking about, what depth did that get planted at? And was it a completely controlled environment, or was there, any frost action for tillering, anything like that?
So it was completely controlled. I mean, it's in the greenhouse. We seeded at, I want to say 2 inches, if I'm not mistaken. It may have been, I seeded it. I'm really bad on the spot, but I seeded it at the depth, the recommended depth. And I will say that after a couple weeks, we did go back in, and if there was, if we weren't seeing complete emergence, then we did reseed, just to kind of say, okay, well, maybe, and then just kind of went from there. But yeah, completely controlled and no frost.
So one person said that their biggest concern with mulching is the soil structure and water movement / drainage issues. Did you consider that in your studies?
So in drainage from, I guess from what perspective? Just that it would impede drainage?
That would be my guess, yes.
So I would say, I mean, in most cases that you would probably be wanting to tile drain as well. So that could mitigate some of that issue. And then the other issue was with soil structure, correct? So we are looking at aggregate stability as an indicator for that, because it totally makes sense. You're going in there and you're just, really grinding things up. So we did get to that actually in the Thunder Bay samples, and I see that Peter and Rudy, I sampled both of their places, so they're on the call. We didn't finish, but there was no significant effect between conventional and mulching in that case. And yeah.
Okay, interesting. And then I guess just with a basic question about the land clearing. So what sort of a machine or implement was used to mulch the vegetation?
So in the case of in the Cochrane and Temiskaming studies, I think I had those implements up there. I wasn't there when they did it. So I'm just relying on the initial reports. Locally, it's been varied. So that's another factor to take into consideration, where there's a couple of producers locally that have done like the full mulching, subsoiling, where others have, I feel, kind of gone in more with like a forest shredder and incorporated wood that way. So the approaches as well are somewhat varied.
And so a University of Guelph study at Temiskaming on carbon retention indicated that pastures stored more carbon in soil than crop or forest land. Did you contrast pasture land to cleared land for carbon retention for this study? Or grassland, not necessarily pasture land?
Yep, so that's another great question. And so in the Thunder Bay study, we did measure. I had a long conversation with Christine O'Reilly about this and what to call it versus, so like a perennial forage versus annual crops. And what's interesting about those findings was that really early on, the perennial forage was lower and the annual crop was a lot higher, which was interesting, and I think might be driven by nutrient management to a certain extent. But once we get out into those later stages, then yes, pasture was comparable, or perennial forage was comparable to the forest. We were expecting that it would be higher, but it wasn't, but it was comparable to the forest, and the annual crops were lower.
Mm-hmm. And do you know if there have been any numbers put together on the added fertilizer costs in relation to the yield, either increase or loss?
That is a great question as well. To my knowledge, I don't. I feel like these wonderful producers locally that keep really great records. And so I know anecdotally that, you know, they've said we have thrown like a ton of fertilizer. I remember Carl saying that. That's really what the second part, like this field trial part of the grain farmers study, is designed to look at and to kind of keep track of all of those costs, so that at the end of the day to see, you know, what does make sense, hopefully. Because yeah, fertilizer is not getting cheaper.
Yeah.
That's for sure.
And then, we had a couple of questions in the chat, and I am keeping an eye on the chat, but it is a little bit easier just for everyone if you can put your questions in the little Q&A box instead, and I can keep track of that a little bit easier. But we had a couple of questions about whether there is any sort of preferred or what would be the best choice of plants or crops to help the land after land clearing. And also sort of a similar question, does the inclusion of livestock help speed up that conversion?
Those are both great questions. So in terms of crops, again, this is anecdotal, but has informed the design of the field, the soon-to-be field trial, hopefully, because talking to one local producer who put it into like more of a pasture mix initially, found that like they didn't have any issues with yields. And so if maybe you do put it into some kind of a pasture mix with some nitrogen fixers, that may help to help things along. So great question. Don't have an answer yet, but we are planning on looking at that. I mean, ideally, yes, we would be growing like absolutely everything, but things just get crazy complicated. So we're going to focus on the pasture mix and then the rotation of oats and barley. The second question, which was around, sorry, I'm like, I had it on the tip of my tongue.
Livestock.
So that is, I mean, that was the third site in the study that I didn't look at, that has been, they're working on that, Jason DeRoche, I believe. And yeah, I mean, that's a great question. There's actually, I noticed that they're not on the call, but just for anybody who's interested, and now I'm like, oh my goodness, but you can Google, you can look, they have Willie Steer Ranch out in Nallaloo, Jason Audette. And if you are ever in Thunder Bay, like go and check, like they are ambitious. So they have these heritage cows, and they've gone out and cleared a ton of land, and they are just using the cows to keep the brush from coming up, and they're actually doing a really good job. So that's not a focus of this study in particular, but there's definitely people working on that in the region.
And so have you looked at any fields that have done or that have been cleared a little bit further south, perhaps the North Bay area, versus Cochrane or Thunder Bay?
I haven't. Not to say that I wouldn't go there, because I mean, it's far from where I am right now. It's not so far. We're over in Cochrane and New Liskeard area to zip down there. So short answer is no, but if there's anybody on the call that has done that, I mean, I would love to chat with you.
Perfect. And yeah, I guess maybe once we're done here, I'll get you to put your email in the chat in case anyone wants to, be a part of your project there.
For sure. Thanks, Cameron. Appreciate that.
And well, just a couple more questions here. So are the special properties of some wood, for example, the microbial or antimicrobial properties of cedar, potentially detrimental to soil if included as mulch?
That is another great question. And just thinking about old me before I got really involved in or more involved in the soil side of things. I mean, when I think about where cedar grows, it's usually in pretty swampy areas, because yeah, I'm going back to my old biology days. So in terms of, whether you would cultivate an area like that, I would probably have bigger concerns about cultivating the swamp with the cedar as opposed to the cedar itself. But that is a fantastic question. And that would be a great case where, I mean, I think everything is on a site-by-site basis. And if you saw, hey, there is cedar there, then in all likelihood, maybe take that out and not mulch that in. Because I do think that it is all it's gonna be on a site-by-site basis, but having I guess thinking about how much coarse woody debris is left on site and what makes sense to incorporate would be worthwhile. And it's not that difficult to do.
All right. So P and K was done pre-plant, but what rate of N was applied post-emergence and what growth stage was it applied at?
Oh, that is a great question. I would say, just drawing on what I know about the study, is that the N was applied at the recommended rates based on soil testing, and it would have been applied. I mean, I don't know perfectly, to be perfectly honest. I would say that it would have been applied at the recommended time, but I don't know for certain.
Okay. And then we've just got one more that asks lime. So what would be the role of lime applications in land clearing? I guess it would depend on what the qualities of the soil are.
Exactly. I mean, when I think about a lot of the forests in the area, they're really acidic. So when we did in the greenhouse study, for example, the differences, what jumped out to me was like the amount of lime that you need to apply to bring the pH up to the recommended level. So that again is going to differ depending on where you are and what the site actually looks like. But I mean, if you were converting a site that did have acidic soils, I mean, raising that pH is going to increase the solubility of a lot of nutrients, whether they're added or whether they're just naturally present, because we know the role that pH plays in productivity for a lot of agricultural crops.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you so much for joining us today, Amanda. And yeah, if you'd like to put your email in the chat in case for anyone who would like to get involved in your project there, that would be great. And I'd like to
Yeah.
thank you again for joining us.
Well, thank you for the invitation, and thank you everybody for your attention and your amazing questions. I really love this project, and I think that the results can be made like that much more meaningful by actually having people that are like doing the work, because field trials are one site, and producers are the ones that are living it.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. Yeah, we'll have to have you back in maybe next year or 2 years to talk about what you've learned.
Awesome. Thanks, Cameron.
Thank you.